Welcome to War Era. Thanks to world, the very foundation of global finance, trade, and industry is completely reshaped. A time when the economies of nations were forced to adapt, evolve, and rebuild from the ashes of destruction. World War II wasn't just a military conflict. It was a war that fundamentally altered the global economy in ways that still echo today. Forging about a war which caused unprecedented destruction end up creating the blueprint for the modern economic world. How did nations, struggling with the immediate impacts of war, transform into superpowers, economic giants, and global leaders in just a few short decades? This is the story of how World War II changed the global economy forever. Before we delve into the massive changes that World War II brought about, let's first understand the global economy that existed before the war. The world in the 1930s was facing a crisis of its own. The Great Depression, which began in 1929, had crippled economies across the globe. Unemployment was rampant, poverty widespread, and international trade had come to a near halt. The global economic order was broken, and nations were struggling to maintain stability. During this time, countries like the United States, Great Britain, and Germany were deeply divided by the impacts of the Great Depression. Trade barriers rose, nations sought to protect their industries, and economic nationalism became the norm. But in the shadows of this economic upheaval, political tensions were also rising. By the late 1930s, the world was on the brink of a devastating war, a war that would not only devastate societies, but would ignite the transformation of global economic systems. Checkpoints when war broke out in 1939, economies around the world immediately shifted gears. The industrial output needed to sustain war efforts led to an economic boom in certain countries. Let's look at the United States. In just a few years, America's industrial capacity was transformed from a peacetime economy to one of war. Factories that once produced consumer goods were retooled to produce tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. This war economy model was a game changer. Nations realized that war could drive innovation on an unimaginable scale. The United States, for example, went from producing 100,000 vehicles per year to producing nearly 1 million vehicles annually during the war years. The scale of this shift was mind-blowing. The US became the arsenal of democracy, as President Franklin D. Roosevelt famously called it, supplying not just its own troops, but the Allies as well. By the end of the war, America's industrial production had soared to unprecedented heights, setting the stage for economic dominance in the post-war era. On the other side of the globe, Europe and Japan were being devastated by the war. Cities were flattened, factories destroyed, and entire infrastructures wiped out. While the US emerged from the war economically stronger, nations of Europe were left in ruins. But here's where things get interesting. It wasn't just destruction, it was also an opportunity for reconstruction, reinvention, and realignment of global economic power. In Europe, the war effort had deeply shifted economies towards state-driven economic plans. Nations like Germany, Britain, and France adopted extensive government control over industry during the war. The UK, for example, nationalized major industries, including coal and transportation, to support wartime production. This idea of state intervention in the economy, born out of wartime necessity, would carry into the post-war years and influence economic policies for decades. Let's fast forward to 1945. The war is over, and Europe lies in ruins. But the world, especially the United States, is ready for an economic rebirth. How did this happen? Well, the United States was now the world's leading economic power. By the end of the war, it controlled nearly half of the world's wealth, and it had a booming industrial sector ready to tackle the future. But what really changed the game was the global decision to rebuild, and rebuild fast. This is where the Marshall Plan comes in. With Europe on its knees, the US launched the Marshall Plan in 1948 to help rebuild Western Europe. Over the next few years, the US poured $13 billion, about $130 billion today, into European reconstruction. This initiative didn't just rebuild Europe's infrastructure, it sparked a wave of economic growth that helped establish Europe as a strong economic competitor once again. World War II also set the stage for the creation of institutions that would help govern the global economy for the next century. In 1944, even before the war ended, Allied leaders met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to discuss a new economic order. Out of that meeting came the creation of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. These organizations were designed to stabilize the global economy and promote international cooperation on monetary and financial issues. The Bretton Woods Conference also led to the establishment of a fixed exchange rate system, where the US dollar was pegged to gold and other currencies were pegged to the dollar. This created a stable environment for international trade and investment, which allowed global economies to recover faster. At the same time, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, was established, promoting free trade between nations and laying the foundation for what would eventually become the World Trade Organization, WTO. As the world began to recover, something else started to emerge: global trade. The post-war economic boom wasn't confined to Europe and the US. It also gave birth to a new global economic system where trade between nations became more interconnected than ever before. In the 1950s and 1960s, a new era of consumerism emerged, particularly in the United States. With a booming economy, Americans had more disposable income than ever before. The result? A massive increase in demand for consumer goods: cars, televisions, refrigerators, and more. Companies like General Motors, Ford, and later Apple were born in this era, spurred on by the rapid industrial advancements that were first pushed during the war. But it wasn't just about rebuilding and consumerism. The Cold War brought a new dimension to the global economy. The United States and the Soviet Union were now locked in an ideological struggle, and their economies reflected their competing visions for the future. While the US embraced capitalism, consumerism, and trade, the Soviet Union adhered to a command economy, centralized in the hands of the state. Despite the different economic systems, both superpowers heavily invested in military technologies and global influence. The US economy continued to grow, while the Soviet Union's centralized economy began to stagnate, eventually contributing to its collapse in 1991. Now, fast forward to today. The global economy we live in, the interconnected, highly mobile, and tech-driven economy, has its roots in the post-World War II recovery. The rise of multinational corporations, the boom in global trade, and the creation of international economic institutions all trace their origins to the rebuilding process that followed World War II. While the war caused unimaginable destruction, it also paved the way for an era of unprecedented growth, creating the economic systems and global networks that power the modern world. The war set in motion the forces of globalization, making it possible for goods, services, and people to cross borders at a scale never before seen. World War II reshaped the global economy, but it wasn't just about the aftermath. It was about how nations adapted, innovated, and rebuilt. The economic systems, the institutions, and the philosophies that emerged from the rubble of war have defined the modern world. From the rise of American industrial might to the rebuilding of Europe and the establishment of global financial institutions, World War II was the catalyst for an economic revolution. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you're interested in how the past continues to shape the world we live in today, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. This script is designed to give a deep yet engaging look at how World War II transformed the global economy, offering a unique historical narrative with an exciting hook and a comprehensive breakdown of the key economic changes.